States Act, what the States Act does for U.S. players is, first of all, it's going to be the single biggest catalyst that we've seen in the United States for U.S. cannabis companies. It does three things, two of which people are talking about, the third people aren't talking enough about. And so for U.S. cannabis companies, get that feedback? What is that? Oh, is that? Okay. It does three things. One, it normalizes banking for us. So what that really means is that we have traditional bank financing available to us. So it actually levels the playing field a little bit for smaller companies. They can walk into a bank at some point after the States Act passes, get a small business loan, and actually start a business like any other people in any other industry do. It also allows us to have financing at the same rates that our Canadian counterparts do, things like that. It also fixes an obscure federal tax code issue that we have, 280E. Where we have limitations on what we can deduct. We cannot deduct normal and ordinary business expenses for trafficking activities. And so there's always this inefficient way that you have to set up your companies and layer some of your facilities so that you can make claims later that your costs are actually part of costs of goods sold rather than normal and ordinary business expenses. But the third and by far the most important part of the States Act, in my opinion, is we have never seen, that I'm aware of, a time when there was a super fast growing industry and 99% of the US capital has to sit on the sidelines. And so when the States Act passes, it allows people that are licensed with the SEC to actually freely purchase and trade U.S. cannabis securities. So if you just think about what the implications of that are, you have, right now there are a lot of investors who have done really well in U.S. cannabis already. And that's largely because the opportunity is limited. So what happens at that point, if everybody's fully deployed at the time that there is this swell of demand, but the supply remains the same, you're going to see the prices of these U.S. stocks go way higher. And so that opportunity, and to give you an idea of how much higher, I think the best indicator is if you compare Canadian LPs to U.S. companies on how they trade today. Look at what the relative multiples of the two countries are. We were looking this morning, I don't know if you guys saw, there's a little news about Canopy this morning. But we were looking at how they trade relative to 2020. Their consensus estimates versus ours. 7 times what ours are. The only difference between the two companies, one, Canopy's a different story. They're really creative, right? That's a company I wouldn't bet against. But the biggest difference between the two is we deal in an area that's federally illegal and they don't. It's really the only difference between the two. And you're talking about 7 turns. That's a really significant difference on how those stocks trade. Just underscoring the opportunity for people who are thinking about where to invest. And I'm not saying, by the way, that the Canadian LPs are necessarily overvalued. If you look at them historically, they're undervalued too, relative to the level of growth that they're seeing and that are being projected for them. So the opportunity in the U.S. is remarkable.
So just to follow up, I'm sorry, the difference between the States Act real legalization and full legalization in terms of, I mean, you're basically saying that any investor is going to jump, any of the 99% are going to jump in just with the States Act and the States Act, or is it going to take more, like, what will federal legalization Could you repeat the question?
Sure. So the question has to do with the difference, and I presume for investors, if you have something like the States Act passed versus full decriminalization in the U.S. So the difference for investors, I don't think is significant, because what the States Act does is it effectively removes the federal illegality for states that regulate. So every state that we're in, and every license we have, would be one that is no longer federally illegal. So somebody who holds an SEC license can freely invest in or trade harvest securities. Decriminalization doesn't really add to that part of it. When you think about full decriminalization, you think about how wonky our structures are. I can't think of another place where you have to fully vertically integrate in each state and your products can't cross state lines under any circumstances. Full decriminalization would provide a path to allowing that to occur. Problem, of course, is you've had an entire industry grow up under a different set of laws. And so because they've grown up the way they've grown up, so you have full vertical integration, you have a question when you sit in Arizona versus California. So if you're a politician in Arizona, are you going to allow free importation of cannabis products? The answer is, sounds like a good idea, free market, right? Guess what? No growers in Arizona anymore. California wins. It's a better place to grow cannabis. It's also true when you have, federal decriminalization, then you ask yourselves, would you rather be growing in Ottawa or California? And so the answer is still going to be the same. So there are places in the US that are great places to grow cannabis. California, Oregon, things like that. But are the politicians in Arizona, are the politicians in Maryland going to allow free importation such that they lose jobs, they lose tax revenue, companies start moving away, they take all of their assets and their investments and they shift them to an entirely different state? Pretty unlikely, right? So it's really interesting how the US laws, they've developed in such a way that provide this really unique opportunity that we don't see other places. And so there are certain companies that are poised to take advantage of that opportunity, and others who won't do as well under those circumstances.
I'm not certain to the financial side, but for some of us, this is our first opportunity to see events. In terms of, if you look at Canopy, when you have a $5 billion investment, you've got the cash on the balance sheet, it does have the exact amount of value. But where does the harvest stand in terms of cash on the balance sheet? Because you have the market for more funds, and then you can also talk about the opportunity for a company.
Sure, two very good questions. So first, cash available to us. We raised in our RTO round and the pre-RTO round about $280 million. So we've got $150 million or so on the balance sheet today. We added a REIT to take care of some of our real estate needs so that we don't have to spend in that area. Because for us, I want to use all of the cash I possibly can on cannabis assets. None are going to return like those. There's no other asset class that I'd rather own today. And we recently announced a financing, a convertible debt, that gives us up to $500 million, access to up to $500 million. It's not $5 billion of Constellation's money or their checkbook, but we can, with that money, and so let's talk about the position we were in before we got there. When we did the Verano deal, which is the largest acquisition of a U.S. Player in history, we had all the money necessary to build out all of our facilities. They had all the money necessary to build out all of theirs. We're two profitable companies. So what do we use the cash on the balance sheet for, and what do we use that additional financing money for? It's really simple. Acquire, acquire, acquire. We make no secret of what our intentions are. I tell this story, I've told it before, about when I was a freshman at Arizona State University. I ended up in a upper level political science class. And I walked in and people were talking about concepts. I had no idea what they're talking about. I was so intimidated. Professor walks in and says, the next time you see me, I'm going to be giving you a test. I'm going to do something really unique. I'm going to read to you the questions, and half of you are still going to fail. I went, oh, wow. So what we do is we do something similar. We're going to tell you exactly what we're going to do. We're We're going to go out and do it. But we're so confident that we can do it faster and more efficiently than everybody else. Don't care if everyone has our playbook. We are going to buy assets, particularly wholesale and retail assets, in states where we don't have any and there's a path to profitability. And in states that don't have limitations, we're going to go deeper than we are today. So in some states, we have significant assets, much larger footprints within a particular state than anyone else, but that doesn't mean we're stopping. All of that additional money goes to acquisitions. Why does that matter? There are a lot of companies that have announced deals and they don't have the funding for them, so they're going to have to go to market for it. We also, there's some of these assets, everybody knows who's for sale. Some of the assets are good assets. We have the ability to offer cash and not just stock. The Verano deal happened to be an all-stock deal. In fact, they wanted it to be an all-stock deal because they knew that the stock handed to them at that time was going to be worth more later than cash would. They knew that upon the announcement of that and a number of other things that we were forced to disclose during that transaction, our share price was going to go up. So we're really confident about giving people our stock versus somebody else's. But for those people out there who are a little bit more skeptical, we can add cash to the deal. And so it makes us better at acquiring. Again, we're telling you what we're going to do. We're going to set the state. We're going to build the infrastructure to do it. We're going to go out and do it faster than everybody else. Yes, sir.
Can you talk about the brand challenge? Because keep comparing this industry to a consumer packaged goods industry. Those are dominated by Coke and Pepsi or McDonald's and Burger King versus right now when you go to these stores, there's hundreds of different. Okay, so can you talk about the brand challenge? Because most of these markets that are consumer packaged get the 5 times market cap over revenues and so forth. They are limited brands, relatively easy for the customer to buy versus what we have now, which is basically mind-numbing number of brands and choices within those brands.
Yeah, so the question of brands in the cannabis industry is a popular one, and I can tell you that when we went out initially and started telling the Harvest story, we had people telling us all the time, you got to talk about the brands, the brands, the brands, the brands. And my partner and I, who were doing the roadshow, said, you know what, we're not talking about the brands. Everyone shut up. It's way too early to talk about the brands. We have the largest license footprint in the United States, and we can cover about half the US population. It's premature. What I think is important to talk about is how people are going to develop brands. And I think that's why we shift the conversation over to one about licensure and how deep you can go in a particular state. How much exposure can you provide your products to customers? In some of these states, most of the states are still medical. You're literally talking to 1 to 2.5% of the population in a particular state. Is that an established brand? It's not. The largest brands in cannabis cover less than 10 states. But there are some things we know. One, the way that you develop a brand is by providing the world exposure to that brand. That's licenses. The other thing we know, I think, history tells us that if you want to develop brands, you start in California. You start in California, you build up on the West Coast, and then there's this little state out east that you hit next, and then the middle part of the country fills in. So it is premature. The other thing we do, we always do this exercise, and I always have people in our organization do it when they start talking about, we want, this is a dominant brand, we need to acquire it. We have a running list. 6 months ago, what were the top US brands? 6 months before that, what were the top US brands? 6 months before that, what were they? The most you get is one that carries across 6 months. There are people out there with products that if they have the right access to consumers, they're going to take hold and they can be successful. But they have to understand how building a brand in cannabis is different than putting a deodorant on every shelf in grocery stores and drugstores across the country tomorrow. It's just not how it works. So it's an entirely different process, and one that we have to be really thoughtful about the differences in access in cannabis versus normal consumer packaged goods. But some of the lessons do apply. Yes, sir.
I want to go back to the decriminalization. My sense is that your opinion of states protecting their local constituents is very minority view, and not the consensus view at all. And I'm just curious if you found that that's very much a minority view, or what is the world thinking?
I don't think it's a minority view, but I think that what we do, and so cannabis is a really immature industry on the whole. We've had companies, ours is an old company, we've been around since 2011. So there's a lot of attempts to shape conversations around different things that advantage different people. I have seen, and we've seen let me make the best comparison I can in that situation. I think the way that this works is akin to gambling. So once upon a time, gambling was illegal. And it was controlled by the mob. Then there's this little city out in Nevada that said, come on, let's do this. Developed an industry still controlled by the mob. Then what you saw were additional states tinkering with it. But what you haven't seen is this broad proliferation of casinos everywhere. You've seen a trickle, and the reason you see a trickle is because there's the ability to generate revenue. But that industry has been very successful at keeping people out of their industry and protecting their economics. I think that's the best comparison. And I don't think that it's a minority view. When I've had conversations with politicians, people often talk about tax revenue is like crack to politicians. You don't get to take away somebody's crack. At least that's what I've heard. Yes, sir.
So, how did Canopy approach you folks, or did they?
So it's a great question, and it's a difficult one to answer, because if I lead you one direction, then you're going to apply that logic to other things that we talk about. So here's how I have to answer it. We have conversations with MSOs in the US. We have conversations with LPs in Canada. We have conversations with people who are looking to get into cannabis. We would not be doing our job if we weren't having those conversations all the time. Can't speak to specific rumors or anything like that, or that deal. What I would say is that's a great deal for Canopy that was announced today. It was a great deal for Acreage, but it wasn't us.
Can you talk about what's going on with licenses?
Yes. So the question is about the Department of Health in Pennsylvania. So we recently got a letter from the Department of Health in Pennsylvania, and it said, hey guys, we just read your press release. You're saying you own more licenses than you're allowed to own in the state of Pennsylvania. If you keep making misrepresentations, we're going to take your licenses away. My response is, I am sorry. We forgot, or we failed to explain a little nuance in what happened in Pennsylvania. And that nuance is this. When you look at when there is a license limitation in states, we will do everything we can to push those limits. It's just not a secret, right? We've been doing it, we'll continue to do it, we're required to do it. The difference is a difference between an asset purchase and a stock acquisition. And in this case, Harvest Health and Recreation itself does not own the Pennsylvania licenses. So they're right. We have 7 subsidiaries, each of which have a retail license in Pennsylvania, entitling that subsidiary to open 3 stores. And we recently acquired a company, the stock of a company, that has the ability, or actually has, a cultivation and processing facility. So it is very difficult for us to bridge a gap between being technically correct for regulators and having the investing public understand what the reality is. In that case, we erred on the latter side. And so we will always work with regulators. We will always ensure that we are the most compliant company in a particular state because we know that we need those regulators. It is not a secret, though, that it is our intent to build the largest wholesale and retail footprint in the United States. We're telling the world that we're going to do it. So the Pennsylvania issue is probably not the last time there will be an issue. The other thing there is the genesis of that is that you, in a couple of places, and you see it with the Boston Globe too, you have journalists who want to make a big deal of this. And so that triggers some of these responses from regulators because these journalists are being critical of regulators who are people doing the best job they possibly can. Most of the time they're under-resourced, but they are given a task and they're given direction by their leadership. They have to follow that. And so they're limited in what they can do and what they can say, and they do the best they can. So
none of those licenses are in jeopardy?
the structure, let me answer it this way. The state of Pennsylvania says a single entity can only own 5 retail licenses, entitling you to 15 stores. We had one going into round 2 of applications. We made 6 applications because there are 6 regions in the state of Pennsylvania. We won all 6. We didn't think we were going to win all 6. We then were, just like everyone else, reading the press, and here's what the regulators said. They applied under different entities. The licenses are theirs. Yes, sir.
How would you like your company to be in 2 years?
2 years. 2 years is a time frame. When I go back 2 years and tell you where we were trying to figure out how to raise the money to build out a facility in Ohio. Today, we're the largest license holder across the U.S. with more access to capital than any other multi-state operator. If I had a crystal ball and I could tell you where we'd be in 2 years, I would be a really unique animal, but I'm not. What I can tell you is one of the things that we're learning in cannabis is the ability to stay agile. You want as much flexibility as you can, you want to remain agile, and you want to take advantage of every opportunity that's presented. So in 2 years, I don't know what the legislative landscape looks like. The legislative landscape will shift how people do business. I have honestly very little idea what will happen, except we're telling you today that it is our mission to be the most valuable cannabis company in the world and have more. In 2 years, we will have bigger revenues and bigger EBITDA than any of our competitors. That's our goal, and that's what I would say in 2 years you come back to a conference like this, that's what you judge me on. And that's it. Thank you, guys. Sorry, we gave you the...